talking about building products as an early stage non-technical founder, but maybe just something to mention before I get going. The kind of lessons and some of the things I'm going to be talking about, I think actually apply beyond some of these constraints. I think they definitely apply to founders who are technical, and some of them definitely apply to founders who are even at a little bit of a later stage. I'll start by just telling you a little bit about myself. Nice. So for the last decade, I've been working with, for, or on my own startups. I'm currently overseeing the product development for 10 different venture-backed startups and scale-ups at Oaks Lab, which I'll talk about in a moment. There I also led development of the Oaks Lab Way, which is our product development methodology focused exclusively on building for startups and scale-ups. Prior to that, I had the founding experience of leading sales at a team as we grew it from just a few people to over 100. And I definitely made some of the mistakes that I'm going to be talking about in this presentation. And I'm also an advisor and angel investor in a few different startups. A little bit about Oaks Lab. So we've been around for about 7 years now, and we provide product, design, and engineering for startups. We typically partner with startups and to build their technology with empowered product teams. What that means in practice is we're usually deploying a dedicated product team consisting of a product manager, a design lead, and a tech lead to a startup, and then support them with a team of engineers and QA to build out usually the first or second version of their product. You can see on the right-hand side some of the startups that we've built so far. These range from fintech, food tech, cybersecurity, social media, with a real focus on B2B SaaS. And I'm super proud to say we've launched 35 different startups so far. They're now valued at about $1.5 billion. And on average, a really important metric that we track is how much they actually grow when they work with us. So on average, those startups have been growing by about 12,000% in their valuation within the first couple of years of working with us. But what we're doing is really hard because, as everyone knows, 90% of startups fail. What's really scary as well is that half of those are because they actually never build a product that people want. And you have 15 months as the average seed stage runway. So what that means in practice is you have limited time and resources as an early stage founder to build an awesome product that your users love and customers will pay for. It's not an easy task. But when we work with startups, we tend to become pretty embedded. Our entire methodology is not just about execution, it's about getting very close to the business's go-to-market strategy, getting very close to the business strategy so that we can help build a product that's actually going to help the startup achieve its business goals. And because of that, we've really been able to see some of the pitfalls, the very common pitfalls that our founders have fallen into, but also what they've really done to help them succeed. So today I'm not going to be talking about empty platitudes, I'm actually going to be talking about some practical wisdom of real startups that we've worked with or spoken to. And with that in mind, I'm not going to name any of the startups, obviously, just to protect confidentiality, and you'll see kind of some information redacted as we go through the presentation. But I'm going to be talking about 5 different things today. The first is starting lean and what that really means in 2023. The second is focusing on outcomes over outputs. How can you set the right goals for your company to make sure you get a good outcome? The third is making smart technology choices. Even if you're at the early stage, even if you're as a non-technical founder, how do the technology choices that you make early when building a product potentially affect you down the line? Giving your product time to breathe. How can you build your forecast and set up your business in a way that allows you to fail well and not fail really badly? And finally, working with the right people. You're going to have to grow your team at some point. You can't do it all yourself. How do you think about hiring those first people when building your product? So I'm going to begin by talking about starting lean, and everyone knows this word. It's an absolute buzzword in this area of the world. And the concept's been around for a long time, the concept of the MVP. Everyone talks about MVPs. Everyone knows theoretically what they are. Ever since Eric Ries wrote The Lean Startup and kind of popularized the term, and he described it as the version of a new product that allows the team to gather the maximum amount of proven customer knowledge with the least amount of effort. And Reid Hoffman also famously said, and this is a quote again I hear people talk about a lot of times, that if you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product, you've launched too late. And not only that, we have real life examples from right here in the Bay Area, kind of legends of Silicon Valley. Companies like Uber, whose very first version of the product is now kind of legendary. It was called Uber Cab, and it was working with one feature in one market, testing one hypothesis. And then Drew Houston at Dropbox, who famously didn't even release a product for his MVP. He literally put a video out, saw that it gained traction, and then used that to raise capital and kind of build out the full product and scale. So it's easy, right? Starting lean, everyone knows how to do it. In my experience, being lean and building MVPs, true MVPs, is much easier to say than do. And I think the reason for that is that as a founder, everyone's a visionary who's a founder. So when you're a visionary, you tend to think not about the version 1, you think about version 25, the SaaS product that's going to have 9 different product components, 100 different integrations, hundreds of millions in revenue. It's going to change the world, right? It's much harder to think about how do you distill that very grand vision down into something you can build in the next couple of months. And I'll use a startup I spoke to recently as an example. And this was a wealth management startup. And he came to us and he said, Andy, I've got a brilliant idea for a wealth management app. It's going to obviously change the world. I've kind of worked in the wealth management space for a while. I've built products before, so I know we have to start lean. And don't worry, because I've already got the scope. But just so you know, we need to release this in 4 to 8 weeks. And we need to move super fast and be lean. And this was the scope he then provided me with. Andy, I want a client mobile application in both Android and iOS. I want dashboard and analytics and notifications. I want to have white label branding. I want to have messenger functionality. I need to integrate with a few different APIs for bill payments. I want secure document exchange and storage. I need a password sharing integration. And also I need a management web portal. And in there I need role-based access control, messaging, workflow management tool, dashboard and analytics as well for good measure. And amusingly, this was the message that scope came with. As you can see, the scope is very limited for the MVP. We're trying to keep things super simple so we can test the use case and get feedback. Maybe if anyone wants to kind of shout out, what's the problem in building the first version of your product like this? Yeah, it's not lean, right? It's super big. To go into a bit of detail, and this is what we told him. Look, users might not want any of this. He'd spoken to 2 users who both work for the same company, who are his friends, which is always a bad idea. And to be honest, we didn't even know if people were going to actually use this product. We actually saw a lot of challenges with the potential business model. Secondly, engineers are super expensive. I can tell you right now, that thing is not going to take 4 to 8 weeks and, tens of thousands of dollars to build. That's going to take hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions if you want to do it at a big scale. And maybe worst of all, it's going to take absolutely ages to actually validate any of the above questions, to actually see if users do want it. And that's not good, because by the time that, I think the founder had raised $150,000 at this point, he was going to spend all of that on building a product that he wasn't even sure that users were going to like. As an early stage founder, the analogy of not trying to hit home runs necessarily, but just giving yourself as many at-bats as possible to get it right is really, really key. But again, sometimes that's not the kind of most easy thing to do psychologically, because to get something out into users' hands really quickly also opens you up for rejection. It opens you up to the fact that, hey, maybe people don't actually want this. Compare that to another startup who we worked with. And they were a pre-seed HR tech startup, and they were working on a platform on the future of work. And this is the app they actually came to us with. They raised a small seed round as well. They actually raised the same amount, $150,000. They built the MVP in Bubble as a way to limit engineering costs, and they actually did that with some of their customers. So their customers were actually talking to them regularly about what was going to go in the application. For any of you who don't know Bubble, it's a no-code, drag-and-drop development tool. It's kind of hard to learn, but it's very, very affordable. And not only that, they were actually able to close a few deals with the Bubble MVP to validate the business model. Okay, this is something people actually want, before they went out and built the full custom solution. So a few takeaways here on starting lean. Firstly, identify the specific idea that you're trying to validate with your MVP. Don't try to do anything at once. And as I said earlier, that's going to require talking to the customers a lot, probably before you even build anything. And something that we often see with our founders is when they're talking to customers, they maybe don't ask the right questions. They maybe ask questions to get answers that they want to hear. So really, really be open and honest with those first few customers that you speak to. Secondly, prioritize the features for your MVP ruthlessly. Cut anything that isn't going to help you identify that specific idea you're trying to validate. And thirdly, research and leverage tools that are going to help you to bootstrap that proof of concept or MVP. It's amazing to me how many founders I still speak to who think that the only way they can build the first version of their product is to custom code it in a traditional programming language. That's just not the case. Webflow is an amazing tool that you can build great front ends with, and when you pair it with something like Zapier, suddenly you can build a lot of functionality and hack it together without really spending a lot of money on engineering and even doing it yourself. I actually met a startup recently who was just raising, I think, a $10 million Series A, and to that day, 90% of their tech stack was still built on Airtable. And on top of that, they had a few kind of front-end custom components, but they were actually using Airtable to power the majority of their tech stack. I already mentioned Bubble as a great tool. Like I said, it can be challenging to learn, but once you use it, it allows you to iterate really quickly. There's this startup in San Francisco called OpenAI, and they're kind of small and just getting started, but in all seriousness, this brings with it huge opportunity. We're probably not there quite yet in terms of pure text to code, although you probably have seen on Twitter people generating code who are non-technical, using a tool like Replit, which is an online integrated development environment, and just building something themselves just by using text to code. But at a bare minimum, make sure that if you're working with a product team, they're using GitHub Copilot, or they're using ChatGPT to write test cases or to help them write user stories. There's really no excuse right now for you not to be using these tools to accelerate product development. So, point number one, starting lean. The second is focusing on outcomes over outputs. And the reason I want to talk about this is so many founders come to us, and the first thing they always want to talk about is the scope. They want to give me 50 features that needs to go in their application. And often that's not the best way to think about building the first version of your product. So the questions that I'm usually asking them are very different. I'll usually be asking them, what is your long-term vision for the business? Where do you actually want to get to? What do you want to achieve this year? What amount of money do you want to raise? What are your fundraising milestones if you've raised from a VC? What do you want to get to in terms of user acquisition or user retention or NPS, whatever metrics it is you're tracking? And then also, what do you want to achieve in the next 3 months? And it's interesting because a lot of the founders I speak to, and I don't want to paint everyone with a single brush, obviously, are usually very good at answering the first question, pretty good at answering the second question, and often quite bad at answering the third question, breaking down their vision into kind of smaller bite-sized chunks. We kind of refer to it at Oaks Lab as the missing middle between kind of strategy and the day-to-day work. And the reason this is so important is that if you don't have clear goals for what you actually want to achieve with your product, that's when things can go wrong. And I'll give you an example of actually a pretty large startup scale-up that we're currently working with. They're a Series B fintech startup. They actually came to us looking to rebuild some legacy technology they had from scratch. And the initial requirements they gave us were pretty simple. They said, hey, we want to release a new version of the product in a modern technology stack by November. And I want it to look like Coinbase. That was the brief we got, and there are obviously a few problems with approaching building the product like this. I'm sure a few of you can guess what they are. The first is that the focus of what we were doing was all about releasing this product in November, no matter what, rather than delivering value to users. We saw a lot of challenges with their existing products. We were a little concerned that we really didn't have much user input in the designs that we were doing. We were really challenging the stakeholder. That's what we do at Oaks. We're really constantly trying to challenge them on making sure that their product strategy makes sense. Because, to be honest, product strategy is where the majority of products fail, in my view, not the actual product execution. But we were never really able to get access to the users for a very long time on this project. And guess what? It turns out the users didn't want it to look like Coinbase. This was a B2B platform, and with very kind of sophisticated investors. And guess what? They have quite different kind of UX requirements to a B2C cryptocurrency app. Thirdly, we measured success purely on the speed of delivery. So the metrics we were talking about regularly were velocity, the number of screens that we delivered, what percentage we were into UAT, which they're great project management metrics. They're very bad for measuring the success of actually a product. And guess what? We wasted a lot of time and money. Actually, we didn't waste a lot of time and money. The startup wasted a lot of time and money on building the wrong things. And we're still actually working with this company. We've really changed the process now. We're much more embedded in speaking to their users and understanding what they need, because we made a lot of mistakes as a product team that ended up taking us down the wrong path. Compare that to another Series B fintech startup that we worked with right from the start when we were building their MVP. They're actually working in kind of a similar market. And what they were doing is building a product that would help to streamline the workflow of public listings. The way they set goals was very different. They had kind of one key goal, which everyone in the company was aware of. Guys, we want to cut the listing time to a certain number of months. I'm not going to share what it was. And what was amazing is that they used milestones for each release to measure how that listing time was coming down. They use that goal to prioritize new features. This is one of, in my opinion, the main advantages of goals when it comes to building products. Without goals, prioritization can be a little bit of a shit show, because everyone has an opinion on what feature should go in the next roadmap, should be released in the next sprint. Goals give you something objective that you can all get behind. So if your goal for a certain month or quarter is to increase user acquisition or increase revenue, rather than everyone giving their opinion on which feature needs to be developed, you can all just talk about which feature is going to bring you the most revenue or not. And also, this goal was motivational. It united the whole team. It united engineers, it united designers, it united product managers. So it's also super motivational to be invested in outcomes rather than outputs. So a few key takeaways here. The first is to really set smart goals for your product team, or even for yourself, and tie them to fundraising milestones and empower your team. The second is to limit your initiatives. One of my favorite quotes is that the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. This is particularly true in product development. I'm sure all of you who are building products right now have the most enormous icebox product roadmap that you're trying to develop at the moment. I firmly believe that many of the startups we've worked with, or startups I've worked on, could probably have cut the initiatives that we were working on in half, and it would have been a good thing for our companies. And finally, make sure you focus on the function rather than the form of something. Wanting something to look like Coinbase is nice, it's great, but it doesn't really affect whether or not a user is going to find value in the product. You know, ultimately the UI is a nice value add at the end, particularly for B2B products. So really get stuck into the flows, understanding what the user needs, what problem you're solving, rather than getting excited about color palettes and logos. So the third thing I'm going to be talking about is making smart technology choices. So whether you're non-technical or technical, those initial technologies you make may have some ramifications down the line when building a product. And I'll use an example of, again, a startup that we began working with. They were another fintech startup. They were providing savings programs to credit unions. And they actually approached us with the first version of their product. And at Oaks Lab, we like to call this a Frankenstein. This is what it looked like. On the front end, they had one application that was written in Angular, one application that was written in Vue.js, one application that was written in React, and then a marketing website in WordPress. And then on the back end, they used REST API for their middleware. They then had a combination of 3 different backends. One was in C#, one was in PHP, and worst of all, one was actually in a proprietary framework tied to a vendor they worked with. So what that means in practice, for those who aren't aware of what a proprietary framework is, this vendor that they were working with were literally the only people in the world who could use this technology, which obviously means they've been locked into using that vendor long term. And you know, any of these top technologies in isolation are absolutely fine. Ultimately, like the technologies you choose, beyond some kind of specific reasons why they may or may not work for certain types of products, it's kind of horses for courses. But when you build out a product like this, it brings you a lot of challenges with it. And that includes that this product is going to take multiple engineers on call just to maintain. So they were an early stage startup, right? So they didn't have like a large burn that they could spend every month on engineers. There may be an engineer in this world who is very good at all of those technologies. I'm yet to meet them, and they're probably earning a lot of money right now, so this startup probably couldn't afford them. But it's going to be really expensive just to even maintain this product, and really hard to make sure you have all those people ready. The second point is that as they scale, if they were to scale with that tech stack, the hiring and team structure is going to be really challenging. You're going to have to hire for 6 different kind of frameworks, languages, and some of those technologies aren't as popular as others. So it's going to be really difficult as that company grows to grow quickly. And finally, they're going to have to rebuild that part of their technology completely that was vendor locked in. So a little bit about our common technology stack. So we actually moved to this now quite a long time ago, kind of 5 years ago, and it's remained pretty common for us. Like I said, there is no reason that one technology stack in isolation is better than another, but it makes sense to think about the technology stack as a whole. So at Oaks Lab, we use a full stack JavaScript tech stack. What that means in practice is React, which you've all heard of on the front end, GraphQL for middleware, and then Node.js, which is a JavaScript environment on the back end. Then you'll also see a little logo at the top for MUI, which is a component library built on top of React, which enables you to use reusable components that already exist in your product. And there's a lot of advantages to this tech stack. The first is that Node.js, React, TypeScript, JavaScript have huge communities, which make it really, really easy to hire as you grow. So, I always talk to founders about, imagine it's 2 years in the future and you're in that kind of blitz scaling phase and you've got to hire 30 engineers. What's going to be the technology that allows you to do that? Secondly, because we use component-based architecture with MUI and React, that makes it much faster for us to get started. To give you an idea of what using something like MUI or React means, it means that you already have the code and the design component ready to go so that you're not redesigning and re-engineering something like a login page from scratch. It's 2023, you shouldn't really have to do that. You should focus on the most important functionality. And finally, to solve that problem of having to hire the superhuman engineer who knows absolutely everything, full stack JavaScript will usually allow a full stack engineer to work across the entire product. A few takeaways from this. Firstly, if you are non-technical as a founder, at least educate yourself on the pros and cons of the technologies that your partner or CTO is recommending. And if you're unsure, seek advice. Secondly, try to choose popular technologies that will make it easy to scale and hire. Something that our CTO often uses when talking about this is choosing leading edge rather than bleeding edge technologies. And finally, make sure your team is using technologies which speeds up the delivery of the product. There are loads of tools out there that you can use that make it easier to build, particularly at that MVP phase. And as something I'll mention later on, not all designers and engineers necessarily want to use those tools. I'll mention it later on, but designers love to design and engineers love to code. So that doesn't mean they're always ready to cut corners and use some of these tools. So the fourth thing I'm going to be talking about is giving your product time to breathe. Now, when a startup is building out a financial forecast, a P&L, they are trying to do a few things. They're trying to do something that's reasonably realistic, I find, but sometimes they're also trying to do something which is, going to impress investors and show the hockey stick growth that's going to allow them to raise capital. I'm going to paint a picture of the type of very, very simplified and maybe slightly exaggerated P&L that I typically see from our founders when they talk about their forecasts with us. So let's imagine this startup. It's just a three-line P&L. So it's January, and they're kind of getting kicked off with product development. They've hired a bunch of engineers and product people and designers to build out the first version of their MVP. So they're spending $40,000 a month on their product team. In February, they're still doing that. They're heads down with building the product, so no revenue's coming in at all. But then March hits, and they're going to release the MVP, and at this stage, they're also going to hire 2 account executives, because obviously they've built the MVP now, and we're ready to sell it, right? So we'll obviously start selling it. And in March, we're obviously going to have closed our first $5,000 in revenue because we've released the MVP, it's ready to go, that's how startups work. And sales expenses go up as we hire these 2 salespeople, and the product team are going to scale it down. because obviously now we built the MVP, it's ready to go, now it's just about making some small tweaks and fixes. And then obviously this is a startup, this is Silicon Valley, so we'll double our revenue in month 2. We'll double our revenue again in month 3, and then in month 4 we'll double it again, because that is how startups work. And obviously this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek and maybe slightly exaggerated, but I genuinely have seen forecasts that look like this from our founders. And there are a number of problems with this approach, as you probably know. The first is that you are putting heavy, heavy pressure on the first version of your product to be really successful, for users to want to use it. In reality, this, it rarely does happen. It has happened before, I'm sure, and I've seen it happen a couple of times. But in reality, it's going to take you some time to be able to find product market fit, to be able to bring in that first bit of revenue. Perhaps on top of that, what's even worse is because you've scaled down your product team, you now have no room to pivot or change strategy or build new features. So many startups have been successful on their 10th try of building their product, and you're banking that you're always only going to be successful on your first. And finally, we're adding sales roles before you even know you've got a product that people want to buy. Having run sales teams myself and actually been selling things that I know is not ready for the customer, this is pretty bad. It actually creates a pretty toxic environment in a company, and it's only going to end one way, which is the sales team's going to leave and you're going to start at square one again. Compare that to a really successful startup that we've worked with. They're actually a Series B, B2B SaaS startup. They came to us with just one person, the founder at the time, and they iterated the product with us and with a few customers before releasing at scale. So they spent a really long time with the customers that they were working with, making sure they were happy with the functionality, spending a lot of time understanding how they were currently solving the problem that this product solved. They also really doubled down and focused on a specific niche. In this case, it was consultancies in their area. And they said, hey, we're just going to start by only selling to consultancies and building for consultancies. And finally, they actually closed 6 large enterprise deals before investing any significant money in sales and marketing. This is one that I always speak to our founders about. Some founders don't love sales. They don't love going out and getting their hands dirty and selling. But this is something I always advise our founders to do themselves, to make sure that they are selling the first few contracts themselves, mainly because they're going to know the product the best, but also sales and product are so connected in that first couple of years as you build a company. Almost all of your best feedback is going to come from those sales meetings and making sure you ask the right questions. So this one's super important. So a few takeaways here. Avoid hiring heavily until you start to gain early signs of product market fit. Now, product market fit is a pretty nebulous term. It means different things to different people, and there could be a whole presentation just on that. But until you start to see that people are really pulling it out of your hands, are really willing to pay for what you've built. Secondly, build your P&L and forecast in a way that gives your product time to fail. There's good types of failure and bad types of failure. The good failure is when you build a feature and your user tells you, hey, I don't think I need that, but if you built this, that would be great. Bad failure is running out of money. Try to avoid that. And finally, try to find your niche and double down. Again, we spend a lot of time not just working on the kind of product market fit with our founders, but really understanding what their go-to-market is. Because it affects product so in such a big way. And I see so many of our very early stage founders immediately trying to sell to SMEs and enterprises. And that's really challenging because, as you guys probably know, SMEs and enterprises are almost certainly going to require completely different features in the product, but they're also going to require completely different types of salespeople and completely different sales cycles. So trying to do both is going to mean that you do probably neither well out of the gate. So really make sure you understand who you're selling to, and then make sure that your product team understands that as well. So on the note of your product team, the final thing I'm going to talk about is working with the right people. Because at some point you're going to say, I want to work with a vendor, or I want to hire my first engineer, or I want to bring in a technical co-founder or a non-technical co-founder. And making sure you choose those people carefully is super important. And there's a good story of actually a startup I just even spoke to last week and added it to this presentation to kind of illustrate this point. But the reason this is so important is that there are a bunch of paradoxes when it comes to building products. Even in this presentation, I've probably given you very conflicting advice. For example, you need to build fast, but you need to be ready to scale. You need to do loads and loads of discovery work and spend lots of time with your customers, but also sometimes you need to trust your gut. You need to be relentlessly focused and just focus on one thing, one customer type, one problem. But also, you need to be able to pivot. And you need to think really big and have vision if you're going to be a successful founder. But also, you need to be really pragmatic and think about, what's happening in the next couple of weeks. And the reason these paradoxes exist is because, let's be honest, there is no one rule. And all of the decision making is situational. You're never going to make one big decision that's going to either make or break the startup or make or break your product. It's lots of micro decisions every day which go into building a successful product. And that means that you need people around you who are either going to be able to hopefully make those micro decisions themselves, or be someone that you can trust to help you make those micro decisions. And again, like I said, this is an example of a startup I met last week, and it's actually, to be honest, kind of sad. So this startup was a pre-seed music tech startup. They were building out their first MVP. And originally they hired a fractional CTO. It was also kind of a co-founder relationship to build out the first MVP. But halfway through, he actually had to leave the project. I think he got offered another job. And so the founder was left with about 50% of an MVP. Then he moved to an offshore software development agency in India, who got the final product to about 80% functionality, but it was of really low quality. There were lots of bugs. It wasn't working properly. There was no way they could release it. They then hired an onshore development team to finish the MVP, but they also weren't able to fix it. They kind of got it to 100%, but there were these core issues with the tech that means they weren't able to release. And we're now about a year into that kind of 15 months average seed stage runway I mentioned. The reason I bring this up is this is not uncommon. There are a lot of very successful startups here doing very well, but there's also a lot of startups that fall into this kind of trap. And they approached us last week, and they want us to take it over the products because, to be honest, it's probably going to have to be rebuilt from scratch, and they might even have to raise additional capital to make that happen. And I want to mention some real things to watch out for when either choosing what vendor to work with or bringing in your first hires. At Oaks Lab now, we've hired kind of hundreds of different product people. We've definitely made some mistakes, but we've noticed kind of what works and what doesn't in those product hires. The first thing I'd mention is try to watch out for people who really don't understand the business, don't really understand what you're trying to achieve as a company, don't have some kind of, at least a base level of business acumen. Because without that, they're going to be the people who are much more interested in that output than what the user really needs. As I kind of talked about earlier there are some engineers and some designers who really would prefer that they were designing or coding in a vacuum, that they got inputs in and then gave outputs back. And to be honest, in an early stage startup, when you're trying to get to product market fit, understanding your customer, trying to find new ways to do things, you need people who are going to have an interest in actually what you're trying to achieve as a business. The fourth thing that I see a lot is kind of on the flip side, people who are so obsessed with discovery, so obsessed with making sure they build the right thing, that they end up doing nothing at all. I've seen this, and often these people, scarily, are very, very, very intelligent. They're usually so smart, but they want to talk so much about what could be built that they kind of miss that bias to action and never actually get something done. Sometimes hiring people from an enterprise environment can be challenging, particularly at the early stage. That being said, I've seen it work. It's just something to be aware of, but people who've worked in, or engineers and designers who've worked in enterprises typically have, let's say, less harsh deadlines, and so they aren't sometimes ready to cut the corners and to do things and to get their hands dirty in a way that a startup requires. And then when it comes to vendors, watch out for vendors who will just take your scope as gospel. You tell them what you want to build, and then they'll just say, okay, here's the price, I'll go do it. Because those vendors probably have they have a vested interest in making sure the scope is as big as possible. They're not interested in making sure that you stay lean or focus on outcomes over outputs. So just be aware of those vendors who aren't trying to narrow your scope. And also be aware of vendors who give you an extremely low price. Software development can be a race to the bottom in many areas. And often a low price is indicative of low quality. And the danger here is that, particularly if you work with vendors, or even if you just hire an engineer, the challenge is that there becomes, if something goes wrong, there becomes a kind of asymmetry of power pretty quickly, because you will probably need that person. If you're 60% into building your product, it's very hard to say, oh, hey, I'm going to go and find someone else to do it, because they have all of this inherent knowledge that they've built up in building the product. So a few key takeaways here. Something that we really tried to do at Oaks is hire for aptitude and attitude as much as experience. We really look for people who are smart, are resourceful, are driven, are willing to get things done. And often those people aren't necessarily the people who have 20 years of experience as an engineer. Secondly, and this is a really important one, try to hire engineers and designers who have a product or business mindset, and give them clear expectations of what you want to achieve as a company. A real danger I see is letting your product be built in a silo from your business. I really, really recommend, even if you're working with vendors, even if you're working with outsourced engineers, get them on calls with your customers. Let them see the impact of what they're building, because they will understand a little bit more about the impact of what they're doing, and they'll also be really motivational. And finally, if you are working with vendors, ensure you vet them for quality. So if you don't know how to do that yourself, reach out to someone technical who you trust. So a little bit of a summary of what I just talked about. Starting lean. How can you actually start lean? Not be lean in name only, which many people are. Secondly, how can you set really smart goals, which are going to help you to build the best possible product? Make smart technology choices. How can you choose technologies at the beginning of your kind of product development journey that are going to help you long term? how can you build your forecast and business in a way that gives you time to fail good by giving your product time to breathe? And finally, once you have to hire people, how can you choose those right people and what should you be aware of? So thanks so much, guys, for taking the time to join, particularly when Shaq's on. And if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, there is a QR code here. Also, check out oakslab.com. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them right now.
That some founders are starting out with these no-coding platforms such as Bubble and whatnot. How often do you see them staying with those platforms, or do you see more often that they, at a certain time, they'll go to another platform once they get to a technical founder and whatnot?
Nice. So the question was, in case anyone didn't hear it, with no code, how often do you see founders moving away from those? Right now, or you pretty much have to. If you're building like B2B SaaS, you're selling to enterprise, there are a bunch of scalability issues with using those tools today. There are a bunch of security issues with using those tools. So they're really right now tools to get you up to speed. But ask me in 5 years' time, and the answer is probably that there are tools that take you a lot further along the journey. But yeah, right now, you would probably have to build something custom at some point.
So hi, hope you're able to hear me clearly now. So we are building a kind of emotional wellness platform for high school students and college students. So we kind of built 3 different versions of MVP, and kind of we are going on a beta launch. So now I'm in a situation, so when to start marketing, because we are not sure about our hypothesis. Like whatever we build, we are also not 100% sure. If that is the case, one side of me is saying we should do right marketing to reach people, and I have to invest money for marketing as well, right? The other side of me, we are not 100% sure about our hypothesis. Should I start telling about what exactly the product all about? So what's the trade-off? Like, you got the point, right? So what I'm trying to say here.
So the question was when to start marketing. That's a good question. To be honest, straight away. We actually use like marketing as a way to even test the idea of the startup really early. If you said you have 3 different hypotheses for what you want to build. If you were to build 3 different websites, put a small AdWords campaign behind them, I think you get a pretty good idea of which one was going to resonate. And then you have a wait list for each one that you can collect and get feedback from those customers on. So I would say pretty quickly, if it's come to your actual launch, it's all about kind of timing, I imagine.
First of all, this was a phenomenal talk. I saw so many people taking pictures, so thank you for that. And I really appreciated your paradox slide, especially. My questions related to that. So your last one on there was about being big and having vision, but also balancing that with being pragmatic. And I was wondering if you had any advice for people through pre-seed, through Series A, who might be working on their pitch and trying to balance that with prospective investors. Talking to them about your big vision, but then actually what are you going to do in the next 3 months? So do you have any advice specifically with building your pitch, talking to investors around that?
Yeah, that's a good question, because obviously investors want to see potential. So if you say to them, oh, right now we have no customers and we probably won't have any customers next month as well, that's obviously being probably too pragmatic. But I think you can be honest about what you want to achieve, and I think it's more about showing a very, very clear steps that you think you have to get to that vision, rather than saying, hey, here's the 5 years, and here's right now. Talk to them about what the 6 months is as well.